It's hard not to love Peter Parker, everyone's friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He's one of the most popular comic book characters of all time, and there's just something about him people gravitate towards. Not only does he save the world on a regular basis, but his introduction helped save Marvel Comics and put them on the map. Everyone knows about his Uncle Ben and Aunt May, but few people know the true story of what happened to Peter's parents. Find out just what it was that set Peter Parker apart from the rest, and why the idea of a teenage superhero was once considered so revolutionary. If you ask the majority of people who came up with the idea for Spider-Man, the overwhelming response would be the late, great Stan Lee. He was the face of Marvel Comics and had a hand in creating some of our favourite superheroes. But that doesn't mean he worked alone, and there's some debate regarding just how much of Peter Parker he was responsible for coming up with. Prior to the introduction of Peter Parker into the world of comic books, teenage characters were relegated to the role of plucky sidekicks. Stan Lee was known for his work with adult heroes such as the Fantastic Four, but now he wanted to try something new. He was aware that teenagers loved reading comics and thought they might like to see a superhero they could really relate to. Stan Lee claims he was scraping the bottom of the barrel for superpowers and decided on a bug-based hero. After passing on names like Insect Man, Mosquito Man, and Fly Man, he finally settled on Spider-Man. The idea of a teenage superhero was wildly unorthodox at the time, but that wasn't the only reason Peter Parker stood out. Back then, heroes were supposed to be pretty much perfect, but Peter Parker struggled with problems many of us can relate to. In addition to struggling to get to class on time, he also grappled with feelings of loneliness, a lack of self-worth, and rejection. Now that Stan had an idea, he needed to work with someone who could make his vision a reality. He first went to famed comic book artist Jack Kirby, but found their visions for the character simply didn't mesh well with one another. Instead, Steve Ditko started working on the project, coming up with the idea for Spider-Man's famous web shooters and iconic costume. However, Jack Kirby has vehemently disputed this version of the events. He claims that he and Captain America creator Joe Simon created a character named Silver Spider, which was what inspired the Spider-Man we know today. He described Stan Lee's involvement with the character as minimal, and accused him of stealing the idea from himself and Joe Simon. Stan Lee disputes this. He claims Jack Kirby told him about Silver Spider, but says it was completely unlike the hero he had envisioned, which was why he chose to work with Steve Ditko instead. Marvel publisher Martin Goodman was always on the search for the next big thing, so when Stan Lee pitched an idea for an arachnid-based teenage hero who struggled with his self-esteem, Martin wasn't quite convinced. Still, he offered to give Stan a chance by allowing his hero to appear in the final issue of Amazing Fantasy number 15. He was later shocked to discover that Spider-Man was a huge hit, and soon became one of Marvel's first hit comic book characters. This kicked off an ongoing solo series which started with The Amazing Spider-Man number 1 in 1963. It's safe to say that Peter Parker has one of the most well-known origin stories in the history of comic books. Everyone knows that his parents passed away, leaving him to be raised by his Uncle Ben and Aunt May. When his Uncle Ben was killed by a criminal Spider-Man had let escape, our masked web-slinger learned a serious lesson about great power and great responsibility. But what about Peter Parker's parents? It turns out they were a pair of CIA agents who were sent on a dangerous mission when Peter was young. The plane crash that claimed their lives was no accident. It was an assassination carried out by none other than Red Skull. In Spider-Man Family Business, which was released in 2014, it was revealed that Richard and Mary Parker also had a daughter named Teresa, who followed in their footsteps to be a CIA agent. Following the loss of his parents, Peter was raised by his aunt and uncle. He was a brilliant student, but was a frequent target of bullies, and this caused him to become rather shy and withdrawn. When he was 15 years old, Peter attended an exhibition on the safe handling of nuclear waste and ended up being bitten by an irradiated spider. While this was a definite mark against the General Tektronix Corporation's safety demonstration, it did imbue Peter with incredible superpowers. Peter Parker has always been a compelling character because of the realistic way he's been depicted. He deals with mundane worries the rest of us can relate to, and this resonates with fans. This was an important component of Spider-Man's origin story as he started working as a masked crime fighter in order to pay the bills. There was a time when he even tried to join up with the Fantastic Four and was horrified to learn they do their crime fighting pro bono. There have also been some other versions of Spider-Man over the years, including Miles Morales, who was the main protagonist in the movies Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Like Peter Parker, he also gained his powers after being bitten by a spider. When he witnesses the demise of Peter Parker, he becomes the new Spider-Man and becomes involved in familiar struggles regarding school and being a superhero. Iron Man gets a lot of credit for coming up with amazing supersuits, but Peter Parker is certainly no slouch in this department. He's come a long way since he showed up for a wrestling match in a pair of sweats, and now he has a suit for pretty much every possible contingency. The original Spider-Man suit designed by Steve Ditko was a red and black design born out of necessity as much as style. At the time, there were serious limitations regarding printing, and it was difficult to get a good blue colour. But later on, the suit was changed to blue and red, and underarm webbing was added to the design. Other than the classic red and blue suit, there's another costume fans just can't get enough of: his symbiote suit. Interestingly enough, it wasn't Steve Ditko or Stan Lee who came up with the idea for this suit, it was a fan of Marvel Comics. Randy Schueller designed a suit which was more durable than the traditional Spidey suit and sold the idea to Marvel for a mere $220. In the comic books, Peter Parker damaged his suit and stumbled upon a new one that turned out to actually be an alien symbiote. Although both the suit and the symbiote, who you might know better as Venom, were a hit with fans, there was one person who hated it. Todd McFarlane was responsible for drawing the comic during that period and admitted he hated illustrating the symbiote suit. Eventually, Peter Parker also got tired of the symbiote, who found a more willing host named Eddie Brock. In the various movie versions of Spider-Man, his suits tend to take a lot of inspiration from the comic books. In Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, the traditional suit was given a scale-like look to add something new for the big screen. We also got to see the symbiote suit straight from the comic books in the third movie. When designing a suit for the Amazing Spider-Man movies, director Mark Webb wanted an updated version of the classic costume. Special attention was paid to the eyes of the costume to make them stand out from the rest of the suit and appear more expressive. Marvel Studios finally incorporated size-changing eyes when the character was introduced to the MCU in Captain America: Civil War. This allowed Spider-Man to come across as much more expressive and emotive, even when his face is covered by a mask. It may seem like a simple change, but it's one audiences really responded to. The most iconic of all of Spider-Man's accessories are his web shooters. Most people are familiar with the standard web fluid which jets out of the web shooters at considerable force. Once the fluid hits the air, it forms an extremely durable and flexible fibre with a strong adhesive quality. Spider-Man also uses a utility belt which holds some useful items, including extra webbing. There's also the spider signal, which heralds his arrival, just in case he wants to make a grand entrance. Everyone knows that when it comes to transportation, Peter Parker's preferred method is using his web shooters. He's able to move quickly and accurately by swinging from his web fluid. Of course, as we saw in Spider-Man Homecoming, this method does have some serious limitations. There's a reason Spider-Man likes to fight crime in the city. When Peter Parker was first introduced, he was depicted as having average intelligence. However, later on, as his story evolved, he was revealed to have a genius-level intellect. Even Marvel heavy hitters have admitted to being impressed with Peter's intellect. Maybe it's not a superpower per se, But if knowledge really is power, then Peter's one of the most powerful characters out there. He's able to control the electrostatic force between his appendages and nearby objects, which allows him to stick to walls, ceilings, and pretty much anything else. As far as physical strength goes, he's incredibly strong and has stated that he has to pull his punches when fighting against non-superpowered humans. His amazing acts of superhuman strength and agility produce less fatigue toxins in his body, which means his levels of stamina and endurance are also superhuman in nature. And then there's his famed spider sense. This skill is hard to quantify, but it's basically an advanced form of precognition which alerts him to nearby dangers. This gives him a heads up when it comes to avoiding dangerous enemies and objects, no matter how well they're hidden. It's an invaluable skill in battle and pairs well with his advanced agility and speed. He's also an incredible martial artist, so even without his spider sense, he's still a formidable opponent. Although Spider-Man is an amazing warrior and has an impressive regenerative ability, it's still possible to harm him. He's still a human, and while he can take much more damage than the average person, he's entirely mortal. It may seem like everyone loves the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, but sadly, that's not true. Peter Parker has his fair share of enemies who aren't charmed by his vulnerable human nature or his witty one-liners. One iconic Spider-Man villain we expect to see in Spider-Man Far From Home is Mysterio. The most well-known version of Mysterio is actually a special effects artist named Quentin Beck, who took on Spider-Man back when he was a relatively young and inexperienced hero. But it turned out Spider-Man wasn't such an easy target, and over the years Mysterio has developed tons of gadgets and illusions specifically to combat him. This longtime enemy of Spider-Man was also one of the founding members of the Sinister Six. Founded by Dr. Octopus, the original Sinister Six also included Mysterio, Electro, Kraven the Hunter, Sandman, and Vulture. We've seen Sandman before in Spider-Man 3, and Adrian Toomes, aka the Vulture, was the villain in Spider-Man Homecoming. Kraven the Hunter is an enemy fans have been eager to see on the big screen, and Black Panther director Ryan Coogler wanted to include him in the movie, but the rights to the character belong to Sony, who claim they have plans to develop their own Kraven movie in the future. Electro is a long and dedicated foe of Spider-Man, who made his first big screen appearance in Amazing Spider-Man 2. Dr. Octopus came up with the idea for the Sinister Six, which should tell you just how much he loves Spider-Man. We've seen Otto Octavius in Spider-Man 2 and a female Doc Ock in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. One of the reasons Dr. Octopus is such a compelling villain is because, in many ways, he's similar to Peter Parker. Some fans describe him as the kind of person Peter may have become if he didn't learn the meaning of responsibility and the importance of helping others. Peter Parker was actually introduced to Dr. Octopus via his good friend and sometimes enemy, Harry Osborn. Harry's the son of Norman Osborn, also known as the Green Goblin, one of Spider-Man's most notable enemies. While Harry does occasionally take on his father's role as the Green Goblin, his relationship with Spider-Man is somewhat more complex due to his friendship with Peter Parker. Norman Osborn's wife perished soon after their son Harry was born, causing Norman to become a cold and distant father. He buried himself in his work, becoming more concerned with profit than raising his child. Eventually, Norman discovered a secret formula which would imbue him with superhuman powers, but Harry tampered with the serum out of anger. This caused it to quite literally blow up in Norman's face, altering his appearance and abilities at the expense of his sanity. He became the Green Goblin. Needless to say, this didn't sit well with Spider-Man. And the more times the Green Goblin was defeated, the more he became obsessed with taking down the masked web crawler. Eventually, he was stricken with amnesia, and his brain formed two distinct personas, Norman Osborn and the Green Goblin. As the Green Goblin, he perpetuated many heinous acts, including kidnapping Gwen Stacy and throwing her off a bridge. As for his son Harry, he once considered Peter Parker to be his best friend, and although he had no shortage of issues with his father, he did his best to protect his secret identity even after he perished. Harry dated Mary Jane for a period of time, but his struggles with addiction meant their relationship was ultimately doomed. At various times, Harry has taken on the role of the Green Goblin, as well as his father's intense hatred of Spider-Man. Peter Parker's relationship with the Osborns is complicated to say the least, so it's no wonder it's been the feature of both the Spider-Man trilogy and the Amazing Spider-Man series. While Spider-Man has no shortage of enemies, he also has no shortage of companions he can call on. Everyone knows about Peter Parker's love for Mary Jane Watson, who becomes his wife in the comic books. Although she doesn't have any superpowers, she's been by Peter's side through some incredibly devastating times. She's kept his secret identity a secret, and the two of them entered into a strong and long-lasting romance after a long period of friendship and mutual respect. Mary Jane was also a close friend with Peter's ex-girlfriend, Gwen Stacy. Gwen became Peter's first true love. After the Green Goblin threw her off a bridge, Peter tried desperately to save her, but his webbing ended up stopping her too suddenly and she couldn't survive the trauma to her neck. Losing Gwen and feeling responsible for the loss was devastating for Peter. Although she didn't end up with Peter Parker, an alternative reality version of Gwen ended up becoming a hero herself. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Peter's friend Ned becomes his guy in the chair. Ned helps Peter manage his personal life and his superhero activities, but in the comic books, Ned Leeds is a reporter for the Daily Bugle, who eventually gets brainwashed into acting as a criminal known as the Hobgoblin. Interestingly enough, the MCU version of Ned is actually more similar to another character known as Ganke Lee, who's best friends with Miles Morales. Ned and Ganke look similar and are both obsessed with superheroes and Legos. Though, to be fair, who isn't obsessed with those? In the comics, Ganke even uses the name Ned as an alias at one point. It's hard to imagine a world without Spider-Man comics, and Spider-Man movies, and video games, and cartoons, and, well, you get the picture. But there was a time when comic book heroes were incredibly different, and while they had many fans, they simply weren't relatable. Peter Parker helped put Marvel Comics on the map, and paved the way for other superheroes to be less than perfect. Sure, everyone knew superheroes had alter egos, but they weren't featured heavily in the comic books. Characters like Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent only existed to present the dilemma of their secret identities being uncovered. Back then, fans didn't root for them the way they did for their costume counterparts, but Peter Parker proved to be every bit as enjoyable a character as Spider-Man, and fans became invested in even the more mundane aspects of his life. This made the stakes higher when he fought enemies, and the consequences of his actions all the more real. Everyone likes to imagine they could be a hero, and Peter Parker made fans feel as though it was possible. While other heroes like Batman and Superman patrolled fictional cities, Peter Parker swung through the streets of New York City. One major theme of the Spider-Man comics has always been consequences. It's nice to think heroes can show up and save the day, but Peter's heroic actions sometimes end up going seriously awry, and he's forced to carry that guilt with him as he moves forward with his crime-fighting career. It's something we've seen echoed with other popular heroes in various formats. When Iron Man came out, it was a big deal that Tony Stark realized what it truly meant to make a fortune developing weapons. He also struggles to balance being a superhero with his personal relationships, and this challenge is something which is perfectly captured in the movie Spider-Man: Homecoming. Adrian Toomes turns to crime following the fallout from the Battle of New York, which took place during The Avengers. Peter tries to balance his school, personal, and home life with his internship. While the world has changed tremendously since Spider-Man made his comic book debut, the things that made him a great and compelling hero haven't. What do you think about the legacy of Spider-Man? Is he one of your favorite comic book characters, or do you not understand what all the hype is about? Tell us what you think in the comments, and then click subscribe for more great videos from CBR. Bye for now!